Thanks very much, Rita, and thanks to Vijay for inviting me here. I'm very, very pleased to be here. I think this is an incredibly important topic that we need to discuss. Just to explain a little bit about Stop the War, we were established nearly 18 years ago now, after the events of 9/11. We've campaigned against the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, Yemen. The list goes on, and unfortunately grows. Somebody said to me the other week that hasn't really been successful, has it? Because there's more wars now than there were 17 years ago, and I'm afraid at that level it hasn't been. I think we live in a very, very dangerous world. We've now got the talk of peace of talks between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un over Korea, which I think anybody should at least welcome the idea of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but I'm sure we're all aware there are very, very big obstacles still towards those talks happening, let alone coming to a conclusion which would be for the benefit of the Korean people and the wider world. We've got a horrible situation in the Middle East. I mean, our most recent demonstration was this week where we protested against the visit of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who was taking tea at Downing Street and at Windsor Castle with the Queen. And of course the result has been a big increase in arms sales for the British arms industry. And these things are not accidental. Saudi Arabia is incredibly important to British industry as it's presently constructed, and therefore successive governments and the royal family have done everything they can to support what is one of the most vile dictatorships, anti-women, anti-human rights, which is also conducting a really brutal war in Yemen. And of course, as has already been said, the victims of these modern wars are not, by and large, Western soldiers or airmen and women or those sorts of people. The victims of these wars are women and children, are civilians who are being bombarded on an absolutely grotesque scale as we speak, in Yemen, in Ghouta, recently in Mosul in Iraq by our own forces. Allegedly, the British didn't kill a single person, not a single civilian, but I find that a remarkable lack of achievement given the bombers that they were using. So we have all these, and of course we live in a country which has a very long history of empire, which has a very long history of militarism, which has the biggest military in the whole of Europe, and which is very, very committed to all these interventions. And I fear in particular that we may be returning to something of a new Cold War in terms of Russia. There have been increasing demands by the military for more military spending in order to defend Eastern Europe against Russia, which doesn't really take into account the role of NATO expansion, for example, which I think has been very negative in terms of the way in which it has been pushed up against the Russian border. And I have to say, over the nerve agent used against the former British spy, although he's always referred to as a Russian spy, but of course he's a Russian person, but he actually was a spy for Britain. I don't see that whatever turns out to be the truth about this, and assuming that even it does come directly from the Kremlin, although there are obviously other explanations that might turn out to be the case, and I notice that the British government is quite careful about what it says at this point. I don't even see, even with the worst scenario here, that this is any justification for more militarism and more war. And I have to agree with what Simon Jenkins said in The Guardian yesterday, that I don't see any moral difference really between what happened there and what the British government is doing with its drone assassinations in Syria and in Iraq. So I feel that we are in a very, very dangerous moment. I'd just like to say, I think, in terms of the peace movement, that although when we always come together, it's always about how much more we have to achieve, and it's quite right that we talk in these terms, I think we should also think about what we have achieved going back over a century now. If you think of people's different attitudes towards war, with all the best efforts of the media, of governments, of the military and all of this, actually there is a very substantial body of anti-war opinion and peace opinion here in this country. And particularly I'd like to pay credit to lots of the women involved in this activity. If you go back to the First World War, you go back to some of the campaigning then, and right through up until today, we've seen some absolutely fantastic organisation and protests that are still going on. So I think this is all the kind of positive side of it. Obviously the negative side of it is that firstly we're up against this huge machine, and secondly we are fragmented in terms of how we approach these questions. And I think obviously today is about whether we can find ways of working more closely together and so on. And I think there's a tremendous move for unity inside British society on the left in terms of people who campaign over these things. At the moment we're facing these very, very big challenges. If you think about not just wars but climate change, which will of course lead to more wars. I mean, even the Americans, when they gained this a few years ago, said that the future wars are likely to come from water shortages and food shortages as a result of climate change, among other things, but which are very, very serious challenges to people in some of the poorest parts of the world. I think we've got to see the connection between the refugee problem, some people call it. Actually, I think that refugees should be able to come to countries like Britain. They're usually victims either of war or of the most appalling conditions in which they live. They travel, and I can't imagine what it's like to travel in the way that they do, crossing the Mediterranean in these boats that they know many of them won't survive and so on. And I think we should have a much more humanitarian response to them, particularly since so many of them are coming here because of what we've done in the countries that they come from. And I think that's something that we need to recognise as well. I would even argue that terrorism, and there's lots of complex reasons for terrorism, and you know it's beyond the scope certainly of the few minutes that I've got, but I would argue that certainly some of these wars have exacerbated terrorism, and the truth is there's far more terrorism, some of it sponsored by countries like Saudi Arabia, which we're happily selling arms to. There's far more terrorism around today, both in the Middle East and Afghanistan and also in the Western countries, as a result, I think, very largely of war. So I think all of these things are major challenges for us, and I think that we need to find as many ways as we can of coming together. I mean, one of the things we're doing at the moment at Stop the War, we've got this tour of meetings. We've had about 25 meetings so far around the country, which have been, we found a new audience is coming to these meetings and very interested in them, and that's on the theme of we need an anti-war government. And we're also going to do another one on why we don't need the special relationship with the United States and what damage that has done over the years. So I don't think we can overcome all the fragmentation, but I'd like to put forward a few suggestions as to perhaps some of the headlines that we could perhaps unite around. I mean, I think the first one, which I'm sure is absolutely uncontroversial, but probably quite difficult to achieve, given the setup of power in the world today, is the idea of peaceful resolution, not war. I mean, war should be, you know, the idea that these people, you know, you get all these people who say, would Jeremy Corbyn launch a war against Russia? Well, I hope not, to tell the truth, because it will mean almost certainly a nuclear war, which will mean the destruction of millions of people's lives. So I think there has to be an alternative, and the idea that somehow there's been more progress made by an aggressive stance, by a militaristic stance. Has there been more progress made, or was there more progress made when the North and South Koreans decided that they would have a joint team at the Winter Olympics? You know, you have to actually look at different ways that you can achieve these sorts of things. And I think that does raise questions about at least some of the institutions which supposedly are safeguarding peace, you know, and who don't always act in this way. I mean, even if you look at things like the responsibility to protect, it's very, very selective in the way that it's used. In other words, it's used often as justification for military intervention, but when you have the Rohingya in Burma who've been treated in the most appalling way, with all the human rights abuses that we've seen in so many countries, then you don't get the same kind of response. So that seems to me is the first thing. The second thing is surely the idea of no nuclear weapons and denuclearisation of the world. I mean, I'm sure people here were very pleased at the Nobel Prize that was given to ICANN last year, and that's a great achievement. But we know that countries like Britain and the United States, and a number of other countries, I'm sure Russia and so on, aren't going to give up their weapons without much more campaigning. And certainly we work very closely with CND and with other organisations to stop nuclear weapons. And I would like to start with stopping Trident in this country, it seems to me. There is absolutely no justification for Trident under any circumstances. And if people are going to lose jobs, let's create jobs in industries where they can do things that would be useful for people around the world. Thirdly, and I suppose connected to this, is I think we should stop arms sales. I don't see that it is morally justifiable that this country has its arms industry as such an important part of its industry. And again, surely we can find ways of building transport, of building ships, of building all sorts of different things that people around the world need, rather than these arms, which are very often used against the domestic populations of the people who are buying them. And then just finally, the question of keeping protesting, which is what we kind of do, and I know that we've worked with lots of you in the room over a whole number of different campaigns. We know that Donald Trump is going to be at the NATO summit in Brussels in July, and the rumour is that he's going to come and visit Britain, and we will. It looks like unity has broken out in that particular campaign, because there were two different campaigns, but it looks like, luckily, we're going to be able to get one big campaign, and I hope everybody will be united in supporting that and in supporting our opposition to Trump, and I think all of our opposition to Trump, not just on grounds of war. I can think of many other reasons that perhaps we might not want to support Donald Trump. Somebody mentioned earlier the idea of building walls to keep people out, which of course he's very, very keen on, this wall on the Mexican border. But I think these are all things that we can unite around in order to take the movement forward. So thank you very much for inviting me.